Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's a pleasure to be back. I see lots of faces I recognize. Hello, Ed. And it's been, I guess, 13 years or so, 14 years since I was here. And I have to say that even in every position I've had since then, I've always thought, will I have students as good as I had my first year? And it's not just that I was working harder than I've ever worked in my life because it was my first job. I think actually Washington and these students really were the most rigorous students that I've ever taught and the most prepared to work very hard and also play very hard. And that was something that I'm sure hasn't changed, and it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be back here and to see so many faces and to be here at the invitation of Sarah Bond, who is going to, I'm certain, go on to do great things in the field of Roman and late Roman history. I'm going to talk today about the topic of my current research, which is the accidental, well, the title is The Accidental Suicide of the Roman Empire. What I'm really working on is the question of Rome's fall and how it fell. And this is, obviously something that has been in the news a lot recently, because the question that everybody always wants to know is, are we Rome, right? I mean, that was the airport bestseller 4 or 5 years ago. And so it's something that, it's a topic that never loses its currency, in a sense. It's the topic of the fall of Rome fascinates endlessly because we're always, all of us, half convinced that our civilization, our culture is hovering on the brink of collapse, or at least irreversible decline. It's a constant rhetoric in modern culture, and every generation makes its fall of Rome in its own image. So, early in the 20th century, Germans like Otto Zech and Tenny Frank, for instance, an American like Tenny Frank, put the fall of Rome down to race mixing. After 1917, the exiled Russian aristocrat Mikhail Rostovtsev argued that the recruitment of the rootless proletariat into the Roman army caused imperial collapse. The Nazis saw the fall of the Roman Empire as historical evidence for German Lebensraum, and the SS created its Ahnenerbe specifically to follow Hitler's conquering armies and uncover the ancient foundations of Germanic settlement. After the 1960s, eco-catastrophists had a brief moment. There was a period when lead poisoning was meant to have brought down the Roman Empire. More recently, specific political concerns have made a mark as well. In the 1980s, for instance, a very important book called Corruption and the Decline of Rome nowadays reads like footnotes on the Iran-Contra scandal and the fall of Reagan's America. Again, soon thereafter, in the 1980s and particularly the 1990s, in the warm glow of European unity, scholars across the continent decided that the Roman Empire had never really fallen. Surfing on giant waves of EU cash, the European Science Foundation sponsored 5 years of conferences and 15 volumes of proceedings on the transformation of the Roman world, which we are meant to think was as friendly a merging of Romans and Germans as was the EU of Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl. Now, all of these different falls of Rome are an improvement on the several decades of work that preceded them, which had mapped the conflict of Axis and allies onto the fall of the Roman Empire. When somebody like Pierre Courcelle wrote movingly about les invasions germaniques, readers saw the Wehrmacht on the march. André Pigagnol, with his epigrammatic Roman civilization did not die peacefully, it was murdered, left no one in any doubt that the murderers were very specifically Germans. And nowadays, partly in reaction to this rose-tinted EU vision of Romano-barbarian harmony, a violent scholarly backlash has set in. British scholars, particularly English scholars of a certain class background, have won plaudits for insisting that the fall of the Roman Empire really was a murder, that it was the death of a healthy polity that stupidly let in too many foreigners, unassimilated barbarians, to survive. And I find it hard not to diagnose this as a reaction to the rise of multiculturalism in Britain in the 1990s. Be that as it may, all of these explanations, and hundreds more like them, there are literally hundreds of explanations for the fall of Rome, they have in common one fundamental belief, and that is that whatever happened to the Roman Empire, barbarians from Northern Europe had a lot to do with it. And that's not surprising, because the idea of barbarians bringing down the empire is rooted in the 16th century, when the Northern Renaissance and the Reformation posited a virtuous northern past to contrast with a debauched and papist south, while the recently discovered manuscript of Tacitus's Germania provided a ready-made handbook to the authentic superior vigor and virtue of the barbarous Germans. And ever since then, the end of antiquity has always been seen as about the opposition between a Roman Mediterranean and a Germanic barbarian north. So I'm laboring this point, and my research labors this point, for a very simple reason, that the tracks of scholarly debate have been worn so deep for so many centuries that all argument naturally runs along the same tracks. Even when one's attempting to critique this at the level of a meta-narrative, one simply cannot help but engage step by step with a script that has been with us so long that we can't ignore it, right? It's just been there too long to ignore. And the point that I'd like to make is that just because a script has been around for a long time doesn't make it true. My own research is an attempt at a sort of radical rewriting of the script of Rome's fall. What I propose overall is that by turning one basic analytical assumption about the ancient world on its head, many other not very controversial aspects of late Roman history start to make considerably more sense. And it's on the basis of this that I'm going to eventually today pronounce my verdict of accidental suicide. But let me get the hard technical bit of the talk out of the way. And for the students in the audience, bear with some technical scholarly stuff. But there's no way to talk about this. It's the most controversial, there's no way not to talk about it. It's the most controversial part of my research. It's the key to the monograph that this paper will eventually be part of. And it's also the analytical insight that cracked open the problem of understanding the 300s and the 400s CE for me. It's been a long time coming. I've been working on this project for 7 or 8 years now in rough embryo. And when I began it, when I started my research, I did it from the accepted analytical standpoint that I now believe to be entirely wrong. Where I started, I'm sure I now know I was entirely wrong. When I started, I was already convinced that the barbarians were not enough to explain the fall of the Roman Empire. But I did think I knew a barbarian when I saw one, and they looked like that. And they looked like this, or this. But they did not, what they didn't look like was that, right? And you can see this. What these pictures are meant to illustrate, even the good governor, is that I accepted a binary distinction between barbarian and Roman as a historical reality. Right? A historical reality that contemporaries recognized and acted upon, that because contemporaries recognized this contrast, it's a valid heuristic for us to use to analyze the past. And what I've since discovered, and what I discovered after about a year of working on this, was that that's not the case. The binary distinction that this set of images makes, for instance, the binary distinction between barbarians and Romans exists solely as a rhetorical device in politics. It's not actually how, practically speaking, anybody taxonomized other individuals. It was purely a rhetorical binary device. And the 4th century world is absolutely suffused with totalizing rhetoric. Pick any topic you like, and you'll find that in the 4th century empire, it's figured rhetorically as a binary opposition between irreconcilable categories. So Christian and pagan, Orthodox, heretic, Roman, barbarian, binaries that are utterly exclusive of one another. And what I've come to realize is that rather than automatically accept these binaries as descriptions of ancient reality, we need to discover how rhetoric and practice intersected, and when and in what circumstances rhetoric and practice intersect. And so the rhetorical figure of the barbarian is a universal, non-Roman other, the other, a stereotype of alterity, composed of vices to balance Roman virtues. And if we take this rhetorical binary at face value, Romans and barbarians are actual categories that contemporaries recognized. And then, if we do that, if that's so, then it's perfectly reasonable to assume that the contrast between Roman and barbarian, civilization and barbarism, is drawn along a geographical line that corresponds to the imperial frontier. Roman, barbarian, right? It's perfectly reasonable if these categories are real categories that contemporaries recognize. Inside is Roman, outside is barbarian. And so we could assume that anyone from outside the imperial frontier would automatically have been subject to the rhetorical stereotyping of a barbarian. And that's what we've always done. We've assumed that. And it's perfectly rational to assume it until you realize that the late antique rhetoric of civilization and barbarism cannot be taken at its face value. What the 3rd and 4th century sources actually show is that the polarizing rhetoric of barbarian and Roman does not correspond to real categories in the way politics is practiced, and certainly not to a geographical distinction between different sides of a frontier. On the contrary, late antique thinking about barbarians is actually about two entirely separate discourses, two entirely separate discourses of difference. On the one hand, we have the totalizing rhetoric, the totalizing division of barbarism and civilization, barbarian and Roman, a rhetoric with roots that go back almost 1,000 years to the Athens of the 5th century BC. On the other hand, though, we find an equally ancient tradition of ethnography, which is a genre that's primarily concerned with classifying and distinguishing among different groups of real people, right? Real people, not binary distinctions, but of real people. And the crucial point, and this is the key that cracked it wide open for me, what we've always missed is that the ethnographic discourse is not a subset of the binary. The ethnographic discourse operates the same way on both sides of the frontier. So, what I mean, we have always viewed ethnic discourse as a subset of a larger distinction between barbarian and Roman, so that in the modern scholarship, ethnic groups from outside the frontier are analyzed as barbarians, and ethnic groups from inside the frontier are analyzed as Roman provincials. Turns out, though, that the sources actually don't warrant this approach at all. Contemporaries are entirely alert to ethnic differences. They're very alert to the differences between different ethnic groups in the world around them, and they're very stereotyping about those ethnic differences, but they are not actually arranged inside a higher level distinction between barbarian and Roman. And therefore, we, as scholars, cannot impose a binary distinction as a tool of analysis, because it doesn't help us analyze anything at all. If we do so, we actually falsify the reality of late Roman politics, and we make the basic error of assuming that some individuals are automatically alien to the Roman state on the basis of their birth, the basis of birth outside the frontiers. And that's just not so. That's just not so. Ethnic and regional factions are a reality of the 4th century. Barbarian and Roman factions, barbarian and Roman groups are not a reality. And this means that we can be historians, as historians, we can analyze the strategies of Alemanni or Syrians or Franks within imperial politics as real historical phenomena that contemporaries recognized as going on amongst them. What we cannot do, and what the sources do not accurately let us do, is to contrast the strategies of barbarians as opposed to the strategies of provincial Romans, because those categories aren't real. They're created by us. They've been created by moderns as analytical lenses on the basis of late ancient rhetoric, not on the basis of late antique practice. And once we realize this, we can go on to ask, how and to what ends the rhetoric of civilization and barbarism was applied in late imperial politics. And what we find is something that might not be surprising to you. We find is that the rhetoric is part of the armory of political invective, the armory of political invective. It's deployed for various purposes and against varying opponents, depending upon the circumstances. And so, for instance, a military usurper, like this general, Magnentius, can be reimagined as a barbarian invader after he lost a civil war. Again, common soldiers might be subsumed within the stereotypes of Roman values, or they might be condemned under the stereotypes of barbarism, depending upon the rhetorical point an author wishes to make. And the key is that as a tool of invective, the rhetoric of barbarism is no more likely to be applied to a Frank, like the general Silvanus, or than to a Pannonian, somebody from modern Hungary inside the empire, like the Emperor Valens. In other words, neither actual regional backgrounds nor ethnic stereotypes automatically elicited a classification as a barbarian or a Roman. And now I'm done with the technical part, so thank you for your patience. I'm going to ask you to take what I just said for granted today. I can demonstrate it through a series of case studies of individual careers. That's actually the major part of this book in some cases, but I've once tried to give a paper on one of these men's careers, and you could watch the audience's faces melting in boredom, so I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to talk about is my analysis of the fall of the Roman Empire. What does this have to do with the fall of the Roman Empire, and what's the point of that? The things I've been talking about all come down to bring me to the key point of my analysis, which is that the way we choose to talk about our world has a profound effect upon how the world actually works. And to give you an example that's been dominant in our lives for the past 10 years, think about this country's efforts to deal with a wide variety of violent Islamic fundamentalisms. By talking in military language, rather than the language of policing or of the security forces, we've created one reality rather than another. It's not necessarily a better or a worse reality, but it's a different one from what the language would have created and the actions implied by the language that we've used. And so choices about actions follow from choices about words. And I believe that this actually helps us understand the otherwise inexplicable speed with which the Roman Empire disappears as a polity in the course of about 30 years, between 395 and by 430 the Western Roman Empire was effectively inoperable at almost every level. And I believe this observation that the way we talk about reality constructs the way politics function is the key to understanding the fall of the Roman world. I'd argue that late imperial reliance upon totalizing discourse, upon these binaries that I've been discussing, actually creates the conditions in which the empire can fall. And so the work really centers on this question. Why does the late Roman Empire develop its preference for totalizing rhetoric? Why does it develop this preference? And then how does the taste for polarizing rhetoric structure political life in a world where regional factions are a political reality in Roman history for the first time? So the 4th century world that I start from is pretty stable. Imperial collapse was not inevitable. And what I think I want to argue is that the gap between totalizing rhetoric within which politics is conducted and the reality of how it's practiced by shifting regional polities and factions make it possible at the end of the century, of the 4th century, for the empire to fall when nobody wants it to. And so I'm going to take about 2-3 minutes to sketch what I take to be the origins of the late imperial mode of totalizing rhetoric, and then I'll move on to the question of the fall. Where does this rhetoric come from? I would argue that it stems from a fundamental change in the character and aspect of Roman government between the end of the 1st century AD and the middle of the 3rd century. And the name I'd give that change is equestrianization. The Roman historians in the audience, I hope, will forgive this a simplification, but in the transition from republic to empire, after that transition, the Roman aristocracy comes to be divided into two fundamentally separate elites, senatorial and equestrian, and both groups had roots in the Republic, obviously, in the politics of the Republic. But under the Empire, they come to play different roles in an increasingly complicated business of governing a territory that's vast and continues to expand for almost 100 years. Senatorial families are limited in number. New senators can only be created on the basis of a personal relationship with the emperor. On the other hand, the equestrian class had begun as a mere census category, and it meant that the barriers to entering imperial service as an equestrian were much lower than the barriers for entering senatorial service. The equestrian order is therefore spread much more widely across the empire than is the senatorial order. And the increasingly professionalized nature of the equestrian class is a function of the equestrians entering and taking over functions of empire that had simply not been needed under the Republic and could not be filled by senators. And there were never enough senators to fill all the posts that needed filling anyway. So we have lots more equestrians distributed much more widely and doing many more things. And this increasingly professionalized administrative specialist class fills ever more positions that had previously been filled by senators as time goes by. Like any good bureaucracy, they also create more tasks for themselves to do, and therefore the need for more bureaucrats. And you can tell I'm a department head because I say that. This was a silent revolution in the Roman state, and it's not until the 3rd century AD that the natural right of senators to rule is really surpassed by an unembarrassed acknowledgement that an equestrian elite should staff the main ministries of the Roman state. And the one consequence of this equestrianization that I think is significant for the later empire in this context is that it brings with it a mindset that helps create this preference for totalizing rhetoric. One of the consequences for Roman government that equestrianization has is a new belief that it's possible to manage things in a fundamentally reproducible and impersonal way across different provinces. In the early empire, where in the empire of Tacitus that many of you will have read about, provincial administration had been haphazard. It had been variable based on ad hoc arrangements that had been put in place sometimes hundreds of years earlier when a region was conquered by Rome. And so in the 3rd century, this new attempt at uniformity of governance was something that was just very, very new in the annals of Roman history. One of its earliest expressions is an edict by the Emperor Caracalla in the year 212, which grants full Roman citizenship to every, or almost every, inhabitant of the empire. At one level, this is a megalomaniac gesture by an emperor who is, by all accounts, probably mad. But at another level, it also is a product of this process that I'm talking about, because it makes imperative the need to work out what giving access to Roman law means for hugely diverse populations who'd always just done things the way they'd always done them, had their own laws, were not subject to Roman law. Suddenly, after 212, a population has overnight become Roman citizens, and bureaucrats have to work out what that means. They've never had to deal with these tens of thousands of people who weren't Romans until the day before. And so that, in turn, leads to the multiplication of more experts and more bureaucrats and more Roman lawyers. By the 220s, we can see, by the 220s AD, we can see an effort to homogenize practice across the entire empire, universal, repeatable practices that simply had not been necessary before. And what this means is that late Roman emperors can aspire to a level of uniformity in every aspect of the empire, of governance, that no early imperial regime would have imagined possible or believed to be necessary. And so in this aspiration to uniformity, of governance, I think is where we find the ideological shift to the totalizing discourses characteristic of the 4th century. It's possible for the first time not just to contemplate an abstractly universal emperor, but also to contemplate uniformity of government across his empire. And that's because the primary shapers of government are an equestrian elite for whom governance is first and foremost managerial. It's a managerial problem. And so this transformation in the bureaucratic attitude was coupled with a crisis of imperial legitimacy in the 3rd century. And what we find is a rhetorical attempt to coerce recognition of unstable emperors and a bureaucratic conviction that uniformity can be achieved and therefore should be achieved in a rhetorical binary that brooks no compromise. And the most immediate example is one that you will all know about, and that is Christian persecution under the emperors Decius and Valerian. This is probably the most striking example of a consequence of this change in governmental culture. The Christian persecutions under both Decius and Valerian articulate an unmistakable message of complete uniformity as the principle that legitimizes these weak and illegitimate emperors, complete uniformity, because the Roman Empire can only be protected if every Roman citizen honors Rome's traditional gods. But at the same time, persecution assumes that this complete religious uniformity is just a managerial problem, Bureaucrats supervise and annotate each person's act of sacrifice and issue little tickets, issue little chits of compliance. What we have, it's exactly like tax, like proving you paid your taxes. What we have in this is an epitome of an equestrian managerial attitude working on behalf of a new totalizing conformist discourse. And so at the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 4th century, Diocletian and his co-emperors, the tetrarchs there, saw, one of whom, as Sarah pointed out, was adopted by his adoptive father on today in 293. Diocletian and his co-emperors really saw the systematic value of bringing practical managerial aspects and aspirations of governance together with ideological uniformity. And they implemented it in every sphere of life, from religion to law to a wholly new system of uniform taxation. And law illustrates what this meant. The practical content of this man's legislation, practical content of Diocletian's legislation, is fully in accordance with classical Roman law. But its form is not classical at all. On the contrary, it adopts a new rhetorical tone that was until very recently, until 15 years ago, mistaken for imprecise bluster that led to confusion. It's a change, actually, but it's now been shown that the Diocletianic law is perfectly standard Roman law, beautifully in conformity with juristic law. It's just written in a totally different rhetorical style. And Constantine lifts this register to a much higher pitch. And so it becomes the normal rhetorical mode for the imperial chanceries in the 4th and the 5th century. Legislation is the first large body of evidence to reveal the gap between rhetoric and content that I regard as the single most salient feature of late imperial government. And that is this totalizing rhetoric that stands at odds with the actual practice of government below the surface. And that's because the reality of 4th century politics is a vastly expanded imperial bureaucracy penetrating much further down into provincial society than ever before, and regional elites operating as regional factions within the empire. Now, this is where we come to the question of the fall. Under the early empire, under the period that classicists normally study, whatever small percentage of the regional elite chose to leave their hometown or their home region for a place in empire-wide environment did so in terms of a single empire-wide government and not merely as products of their local place. But by the 4th century, because of the much deeper penetration of imperial government, joining the structure of the emperor's government no longer meant deracination from your home province. You could be both an imperial official and a provincial aristocrat at the same time. And from the 330s onwards, we can trace regional and provincial cliques competing for control of the functions of imperial government in order to benefit men from their own home regions. And one of the tools, in fact, the most important tool of winning these competitions, is the totalizing rhetoric from which I began. What's the most effective way of placing oneself and one's friends in positions of power whilst simultaneously excluding rivals? It's to successfully paint your rivals as the bad half of a rhetorical binary. That is to say, to prove rhetorically, not merely that your rivals are less qualified for power, but rather that they were in their very being, necessarily excluded from the Roman polity, not part of it, and excluded from the protection that the Roman polity offers. And so after Constantine's conversion to Christianity, for instance, pagans and heretics also join barbarians as the negative half of a totalizing rhetorical binary. And throughout the 4th century, if you are able to paint your enemy, your political enemy, as a heretic or as a pagan in the face of the state's machinery, you not only exclude them from power, you put their life in danger. It's a very effective way of excluding someone from power, is getting them killed. And so consequently, you also increase your chances of winning something in the game of politics. And this is where we come to the question of accidental suicide. Because like all functional systems of government, the 4th century government retains spaces in which people can behave in ways that contradict what they said they were doing. So exclusionary rhetorics of civilization and barbarism are available to everyone, regardless of background, and for use against anyone, regardless of background. And although they were inescapable as rhetoric, you had to conform to them rhetorically. You could tacitly ignore them in practice. That's to say, the gap between political rhetoric and political practice in the 4th century was wide, and as long as its existence was not acknowledged, as long as you didn't acknowledge the gap between rhetoric and practice, political life is very stable. So long as everyone spoke as if the world was structured as absolutes, and also simultaneously pragmatically acted pragmatically in their deployment, regional factions, political provincial elites benefit from government enough that its stability is ensured. But the sheer stigmatizing force of rhetorical binaries is such that once the gap between words and practice was acknowledged, if the binaries were the gap between them and practice was acknowledged, the brittle framework of political stability is shattered. And that's exactly what happens at the very end of the 4th century. That's exactly what happens at the end of the 4th century. The gap between the rhetorical belief in how politics is practiced and the actual behavior is recognized, is acted upon, and the stability of the entire system breaks down. How to put it simply, a small number of men at the very end of the 4th century realized accidentally that the rhetoric of barbarism could work to their advantage, and not in the traditional way of as a brush with which to tar one's enemies, right? Rather, it can be embraced as a tool that allows one to do things that are totally impossible inside the equilibrium of traditional politics. And there are several such men. There's half a dozen careers that we can reconstruct along this line. But the best documented example is the Roman general Alaric, probably known to most of you as the Visigoth who sacked Rome. He didn't look like that. Alaric was born inside the Roman Empire. But he was born as part of a population that had been settled in the Balkans after 5 years of warfare, and without being fully integrated into the legal structure of the Roman state, because the Roman state, for a period of about 5 years, was too weak to integrate the generation of Alaric's parents. The 3rd and earlier 4th century empires had a well-established mode of integrating ambitious members of the subaltern classes into the higher levels of society, and they generally did it through the army, through an officers' training corps. Unlike, for instance, the British colonial system, in which native officers remained subordinate to British officers, the late Roman state did not have a 2-track officer corps. Recruitment as an officer trumped any questions of background at the time, and successful officers tended to end up as powerful players in imperial politics. And this is a typical image of a late Roman officer. The integrative function of the officer corps continues to work right through the year 400 or so, but the warfare in the Balkans in the 370s and 380s means that that population in the Balkans is excluded from this traditional avenue of achievement. The population from which Alaric was recruited was recruited into its own separate units, which were never an integral part of the Roman army. When Alaric rose through the ranks, he did so from a position of subordination as a sort of native officer that had really been recreated for the first time in about 300 years in Roman history. Scholars have always seen Alaric as the first in a long line of barbarians in Roman service, of officers in Roman service, as part of the barbarization of the Roman army, and they've argued about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. But my discussion of rhetoric and my analysis of how 4th century politics actually works suggests that barbarians in Roman service, barbarian officers, do not exist as categories and did not exist for contemporaries as categories. They were simply men from different regional backgrounds, men of different ethnicities, all of whom served in the Roman army, went through the same system, even though they came from different regional backgrounds, some of them inside the frontier, some of them outside the frontier, all of whom equally might be demonized as barbarians in political rhetoric, but not because of where they came from, not because of their birth. And so, viewed with this sort of point in mind, Alaric and his fellow officers were not part of a barbarian continuum, which doesn't exist, but rather there's something new, representatives of a population that couldn't function in the way other 4th century regional functions did. And despite this, the old model of advancement by the officer corps remained attractive for Alaric because it was normative, and he attempted to play by the rules of the game, and he tried to advance by that route. He commands his native unit valiantly, he achieves promotion, he wins the notice of the Emperor Theodosius, and throughout his career, you can see that what he wants what he thinks he wants is to be like a normal Roman officer. His demands that on the imperial system are without exception those of an ambitious junior officer. They include promotion for himself and more advantageous service conditions for his men. But Alaric's subaltern position, it turns out, cannot be erased. And quite unintentionally, it's what destroys the normal assumptions of 4th century political life. Alaric seeks a traditional role for himself within the imperial military hierarchy, and he seeks to do it through violence. Again, so far, so traditional. That's not revolutionary. There was a script. There was a time-honored script for violence in 4th century governance. You operate with one, and it's a script that operates within the existing hierarchy of ranks. At its most extreme, it ends in usurpation, which, if successful, replaces individuals, but leaves the system wholly intact. Losers, like the General Magnentius, who I showed you a coin of earlier, would be remembered as having stood outside the Roman polity all along, although until they failed to win the throne, they were no different from anyone else playing the game. But Alaric, because of his circumstances, did not stick to this script, and that was revolutionary. When he was attacked and demonized rhetorically as a barbarian, Alaric embraced the implications of the role, and instead of the sanctioned violence of usurpation, he sought to win an improved place for himself by threatening to attack and destroy the system within which he wanted to place. He would actually act as the stereotypical barbarian other, alternatingly, or sometimes he tried to act as a fully socialized Roman officer. And his cycle of withdrawal, negotiation, and attack sought a position within the emperor's military hierarchy from the position deliberately, consciously, of an outsider. And this shocking novelty displaces the whole discursive stability of 4th century politics. This means that Alaric is in fact a turning point, and not because he led a gang of unassimilated savages to destroy Rome, and not because he sacked Rome the city, which soon recovered. On the contrary, Alaric is a turning point because he was able to recognize a hitherto unseen corollary of 4th century political rhetoric, that there was an advantage to be had from playing at the stereotype of the barbarian. While attempting to work within the imperial system and rise through his ranks, he was also able to step outside the role, and threaten the government as if an outsider. That's what barbarians were always meant to do, after all, rhetorically. But no one before Alaric had seen that there was a point in embracing this role. And this coup, imaginative coup, is so great that Alaric himself cannot profit from it. When he sacks Rome, it's not a triumph, it's the culmination of a frustrated career. It's an act of despair after his every attempt at compromise had met with rebuff or betrayal. But the utility to his approach to politics, to actively play the barbarian, was instantly appreciated by others around him and by those who followed him. The ability was inherent in the totalizing discourse that I started from. But once the secret was laid bare, it's only a matter of time before its use becomes habitual. And so the practice of stepping outside the imperial system and attacking it only in order to find a place in it was adopted by every political figure of any consequence in the 5th century, whether a powerful general like Aetius, a client king like Theodoric, a pirate chieftain like Marcellinus, or the short-lived Emperor Majorian. They all follow the example of Alaric. And each time the tactic worked, further power drained away from the organs of a Roman state that could be handled with such evident contempt. Regional aristocracies, which had long been used to playing for a position at the imperial court in the 4th century, found themselves thrown back upon their own resources or the local strongman who happened to be nearest at the time. And all of this stems from the recognition, I would argue, of a gap between the recognition of the gap between rhetoric and practice of 4th century politics. The 4th century rhetoric of civilization and barbarism is just that. It's a political rhetoric used as a weapon to portray an opponent as standing outside the Roman Commonwealth. But that same political rhetoric contained within it a set of options for political behavior that might be embraced as useful in themselves. Once the way had been shown by a man, Alaric, who was demonized as a barbarian and then decided to do what no one had done before and act like a barbarian, the sheer utility of the approach made its widespread adoption inevitable. And it also destroyed the Western Roman Empire. Over several decades of soldiers jockeying for position within a system by threatening to destroy it, the system itself ceased to be worth fighting for. Once the unintended consequences of 4th century rhetorics were disclosed, it took only a couple of decades, for a generation to realize, with genuine surprise, that the whole structure of imperial government was now so weak that they no longer needed an emperor at all. No one wielded the knife, and no one had willed the end to come, but the political rhetoric of the late Roman Empire had driven it to suicide. Thank you.
Well, Professor Kulikowski will be taking questions in just a second. I wanted to take this brief minute
Hide back here.
I wanted to thank the History Department very much for providing the funds for Professor Kulikowski to come and speak to us today, and give special thanks to the head of the History Department, Ted Delaney, and to the Secretary of the History Department, Jennifer Ashworth, without which this would not have been possible. So I think we're going to go on ahead and take questions, but I just wanted to also take a minute to acknowledge everyone.
Thank you. Anything at all. That's probably much too much in that to be getting on with. So, sure. Yeah.
Why do you think no one before Alaric turned this rhetoric into a reality? Why do you think this was first?
Because there was a satisfactory avenue other than available to them. Very fundamentally, that there was an option. And Alaric and his generation, really it is, and there are options available to lots of people at Alaric's own time. They keep doing it. They continue to try to play by the old 4th century rules and continue to effectively, even while Alaric is going through this the process of his career. It's just, I really do think it's this question of. And the accident of a subaltern population of a sort that just was new to the very end of the 4th century empire, and I think so. I think it's an accident that Alaric's one of the really close to being the first person put in a position where this suddenly the circumstances make it possible for him to see this.
I'm thinking about, I was supposed to understand. You've written about Valerian,
I have.
Where Goths crossed the Danube. And do you see this as not pertaining to the case of Alaric because they weren't second-class citizens, they weren't citizens at all?
Right, exactly. I mean, the events of 376 through 378, which culminate in the Battle of Adrianople, where, of course, an emperor is killed on the battlefield, which is shocking. They're the culmination of, it's not a barbarian invasion of any sort. It's a negotiated transfer of populations that goes very, very badly wrong through incompetence, and it's exactly, and again, it is very much an accident that. The type of maneuver that had worked perfectly well for hundreds of years. You could bring tens of thousands of people from across the Rhine or Danube and settle them comfortably in the Roman provinces. It'd been going on for centuries, and it really never caused any problems. And then going forward, it stopped causing problems. I mean, it worked again several times afterwards. What went wrong was very simply not having enough. I hate to use this phrase, but not having enough boots on the ground at the time to actually make the population transfer work. And once the rebellion started, it got violently out of hand, and so what you have is the Balkans in flames. But Alaric is a descendant of that moment in a sense. Alaric is the end of that. The end result of the Adrianople campaigns is the settlement. Somewhere in what's now Bulgaria, probably, of this population that almost certainly would eventually have been reintegrated in, but in the 390s, when Theodosius had not yet been integrated into the structure of the Roman army, and so served in their own units. And it's again this sort of, accident. The interplay between circumstance and system is a really, really significant way of looking at lots of events in the ancient world, I think. And again, we spoke briefly at lunch. We talked about Augustus today and the way in which the achievement of Octavian, who becomes Augustus, is fundamentally a set of tiny historical accidents, but none of them would have been possible without the structure of a failing republican system, right? And it's the structural failure of the republican system that makes Augustus possible, but it's historical accident that makes Augustus happen. And so I think that's really what we see here is that there's no inevitability of the fall of Rome. I mean, that's of the fall of the Roman Empire. you know. Rachel, yes?
This polemical labeling of barbarian versus that's going on at the elite political class, is this being replicated or embraced on a popular level so that it has some sort of cachet that everybody else is well too?
Well, you know, the difficulty, of course, is recording any non-elite voices in the ancient world. I mean, the one thing I will say is that coins disseminate this rhetorical binary so widely that I think everybody, and the Roman Empire is a heavily monetized economy in the 4th century. Small changes everywhere, and you know, I should have actually put up a picture of the reverse of one of the most common coins, which is of an emperor dragging a barbarian by the hair, or of a horseman with a spear lancing a little barbarian like this on the ground. And so in a sense of the diffusion of the image of a binary between Roman emperor looking stern on one side of the coin and barbarian being trampled on the other, it's, I mean, that binary must have penetrated very widely as a meme or something. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in your lecture about how choice about actions follow choice about words, and I was wondering what the literature was like during this period. Was there any attempt to use the literature to bring in these barbarians and assimilate them into the Roman side, the Roman half of this binary, and yet to keep the binary alive?
Right. I mean, it's all part of the tool of yes. The answer is yes. Now, and in fact, the literature is what shows you that these binaries don't correspond to real categories, right? Because the same person who is, take the Emperor Valens, who is a learned model Roman emperor in some discourses, and is literally made into the image of a barbarian savage in other accounts. And you're mentioning Ammianus Marcellinus would be one of the main places where Valens is portrayed. Not just as a bumbling rural dolt, but as an actual barbarian. And again, it's very much circumstantial. But yes, of course, we have quite a lot of, in fact, sometimes the same author, depending upon what the speech or the literary text is for, will write about the same person, placing them subtly in one camp or another, or in a different way. And we find the same thing. I mean, there's a level at which everything I'm talking about has already been worked over very thoroughly in terms of heresy and orthodoxy. So all the last 25 years of talking about constructing orthodoxy versus and constructing heresy through politics at church councils is very similar to what we find in the literary sources for this stuff.
There's a little uncertainty to thrust your remarks with which you began the talk, in which you reviewed previous theories of the fall of Rome and connected them with historical circumstances at the time in which they were formulated, suggesting, I think, that they were a little blinkered and preoccupied with contemporary concerns, and that this was driving their explanatory model. And then you presented this model and connected it with, our demonization of the Islamic world. And I wonder whether this is meant to throw light on our relationship to the Islamic world, or as far as totalizing discourse, being the Achilles heel of the civilization. Is this a strike against you that you're?
No. I think we need not at all. I mean, I think I think that every generation does remake its own. Make its own version of the fall of Rome. The book I wrote about the Goths was reviewed in Germany as being the post-9/11 American version of the Gothic Wars, and it was reviewed in the Weekly Standard as an anti-American tract. So it was, quite literally, and so again, I flagged that up in order to very consciously point out that there's no way not to be informed by what you see in the world around you and in your reading of the past. And not because any one reading of the fall of Rome is right. And I mean, there are some that we can exclude. I don't think lead poisoning brought down Rome. But there are lots of things. This reading is not exclusive of a dozen other equally important ways of thinking about the fall of Rome. But it's clear to me that my thinking about how imperial structures function at the edge of empire and amongst subaltern classes and groups is clearly informed by what we see going on around, what I've seen going on around me in the past 10, 15 years, and also by a difficult book, but the book Blowback, that talks about effectively the creation of problems for the American empire by both Soviet and American behavior during the late stages of the Cold War. And I think that there's a level at which that's clearly had an impact on my thinking that I couldn't possibly deny. So.
Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.